Welcome to video number 6 on our 1974 Mercury Capri that we're getting ready for 24 Hours of Lemons. We've got a 2005 Mustang donor engine and suspension that we're trying to fit here. In the last video we talked about narrowing the Mustang suspension to fit. At the time I thought I could take 4 inches out of it and line up with the frame rails of the Capri, which was true, but the problem we've run into is that the front frame rails on the Mustang are about 9 inches higher than the floor of the Mustang, the cab of the Mustang. On the Capri, this is the original crossmember there, the frame rails sit a lot lower relative to the body of the car. So this is kind of looking from the outside. Those frame rails run right through there, and there's really just a few inches. It's like 3 inches from the bottom of the rocker panel up to the frame, where the Mustang's got 9 inches lift there. So if we just bolted this thing, shortened it up and bolted it to the front frame of the Capri would be riding about 6 inches high on the front, which was too much. So we were trying to figure out how to engineer around this. And basically the thinking was that we were just going to narrow this front end more. To do that, we're going to remove the steering gear, and we're going to remove the strut towers and the disc brake assembly and all that. Just take it all off the kingpin on the lower support arms. Anyway, they're an L-shaped lower support arm that's got the kingpin on it. This is a bad video shot. We just didn't put the camera in a good place, so you aren't seeing any of the detail of what we're taking apart on this front crossmember. But we wanted to take everything off so that we could double check the squareness and that this front crossmember hadn't been tweaked in the accident that the donor Mustang had been in. And make it a little easier for fitting. It's lighter without those wheels and struts on it. And so, yeah, here we're checking to make sure it hasn't been tweaked. And it checked out. Everything was flat and square and ready to be chopped up. So we're using a chop saw for one of the cuts, but most of the cuts we got to do here are just scribing a line and being really careful with the right angle grinder with a cutoff wheel. So I think the right angle grinder is probably the official tool of 24 Hours of Lemons. It's very handy and kind of your all-purpose tool for something like this. Anyway, we're making cuts and trimming things up, dressing the cuts, and then I finally have half of a unit I can go fit into the car. Everything's been measurements at this point, although we did kind of we set it in there as a whole unit to just kind of look how far off we were. But now I get to set it up in and see what our options are for getting it up by those frame rails. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to narrow this up enough that we can slide right up in between the front frame rails of the Capri, and then we'll build mounting points off the Capri frame rails to mount it to. Let's see, here we're lowering the car down to kind of ride height. It's kind of a tripod. We've got 2 jack stands on the springs in the back and that jack stand on the front to just kind of get an idea of how low that crossmember's setting in different options. Again, there is pages of measurements that we've taken, but until you actually put the thing in, it just helps me a lot to actually put it into the engine bay. Okay, so now we're cleaning up. We ended up taking 7 inches out of the middle of it. so it would fit between those frame rails. So this is just more cutting and grinding to get it trimmed up, and we do that on both sides. Check for squareness and carefully scribing lines where we need them. Again, most of the cuts are done with a right angle grinder, so you've got to just be really careful, follow your scribe line. And all in all, I think we're good. If we're off a little bit, the way we're likely to be off, because we can use reinforcement when we attach them together, the way we're likely to be off would be for toe in or toe out. And the Mustang front end has quite a bit of adjustment for that. It doesn't have much adjustment for camber or caster. In fact, I'm not sure it has much of any. But you can get camber bolts. Anyway, that was the setup with a temporary piece of wood holding it in place, that front motor mounts. Now we're building a piece of steel connecting. We're going to use the mounting holes for the rack and pinion to kind of hold this whole thing together while we're doing trial fittings of suspension mount points and the engine. It's actually the engine motor mount points too. And then you see the Sawzall, the other important tool of Lemons, I think. Anyway, Keaton's getting that all cleaned up, and then we're going to bolt that thing together a little more rigidly and be able to do some trial fitting with the motor. What we've got to do is get that front suspension support. It's both engine mount, motor mounts, and holds the front suspension, the struts. We've got to get that in, and we've got to figure out how high we can place it up into the engine bay of the Capri to get the ride height right, so the front end isn't sitting up way high. When it's all said and done, we're going to ride a little bit high on the front end on this car, just because the geometry between the Mustang and the Capri, they just aren't a perfect match, and the compromise, letting the front end sit a little high, is worth it to pick up the bigger brakes of the Mustang. Now we're here trying to get measurements for the struts and where they're going to hit. And we're fortunate that Keaton owns, actually his wife Liz owns this Mustang of the same era as our donor Mustang. So we're able to get some suspension measurements off it that I actually had these measurements off the other Mustang, but it had been in the accident and they were off from one side to the other, and I wasn't sure what the true measurement should be, and so we had this Mustang that we could get a good measurements. So here we're checking where those struts will hit the Capri body, and we're pretty happy with where we've got that front cross member set now. Now we're going to see if we can fit the engine in without having to cut the firewall. The engine is, it's a V6 like the original V6 in the Capri, and it's actually based on the Cologne V6 that was originally in the Capri. The lower part of this engine is the same. Now the heads are different; they're a little bit bigger on this Mustang. I mean, this engine makes twice the horsepower of the original V6, so it's a 4-liter, and the original was 2.8. And so it is physically a little bit bigger than the original engine. It's not really longer, but it is taller. And tall is actually where we're more constrained. And as that first fitting showed us that we needed to make some adjustments, we're taking out the battery tray up front. It was going to have to come out anyway at some point, because the Mustang computer lives up in that corner, and fuse box, and so we went ahead and took it out now just so that we could clean up that frame rail if we needed to. We were really looking at sliding things forward just a ½ inch into that space, and we had to cut the mounts and stuff, and we knew it was going to go away anyway, so we took it out. Here we have my daughter and son-in-law's dog Banjo coming to visit. And you'll see we changed out the tilter for the motor. That red one in the first attempt nearly broke on us. We were within the weight limit advertised, but it did not hold up, and provided a scary moment or two. So now we've got a better one, and so this helps that you can tilt the engine enough that you don't have to remove the transmission. You can kind of slide everything in there while that front suspension is in place. And so now we're doing the trial fitting. We actually have the front suspension slid a little further forward than we want it. Here's the two dogs visiting again. And then the other thing we're doing is trying to get the angle of the engine back to the rear differential. And when these older leaf spring rear suspension is leaf spring, and leaf springs bend somewhat under power, and so you have to build in an angle for the, I think it's called a pinion angle, but basically the rear differential ideally points down between 2 and 3 degrees, and the engine points down between 2 and 3 degrees, so you meet, like between 5 and 6 degrees at that rear U-joint when the car's not running or not under power. Because when it is under power, it twists, and that will straighten out that 5 to 6 degrees. But you got to measure all this with the weight that you'd expect to be in the car. So we've got some stuff in the car. We're checking the height where we think the tire will be. Moose is getting his beauty rest there in front of the shot. Let's see. Now we're taking the motor out because we've determined that we can't get the angle that we need. We're basically going... the transmission on the Mustang, the 5-speed transmission on the Mustang, is too big. It's physically larger than the 4-speed on the original Capri, and we're going to have to cut the top of the tunnel, like the first 2 feet in the Mustang. Or not the Mustang, in the Capri, to fit that transmission. So now we're setting, that front crossmember, going, okay, where do we really want it? Since we're going to create some space here for the motor, where do we really want that front crossmember? We've set it where we think it's a little bit further forward than the stock, and we'll see that in another picture here coming up. But right now we're cutting out just the top of the transmission tunnel, the first 2 feet, and a little bit of the firewall. This should be really easy to put back together. In fact, we should be able to make a bolt-on cap out of this thing. We'll just extend the sides a bit, but now we have space for this to go in. Now, I don't know why we removed the tires here, because I'm going to have to put them back in to get the right weight on the rear springs for these measurements. But now we have room to put the engine in with the front suspension in place, and the engine can sit in close enough and sit at the right angle. I'm also checking that we have space for the brake booster, that little clip there. Now we're making additional adjustments to this rear differential and the pinion angle on it. As you put weight on it, it changes, and so we're making adjustments. We're trying to get between 2 and 3 degrees of pinion angle, and then here we're putting weight back in because we're going to put it back down on the springs, and we want to know, for the car driving, how much weight we think is going to be in there. and then we can double check that pinion angle. I'm putting a little digital angle gauge on the differential. We got the good measurement. I guess I didn't throw in a picture of the good measurement, or we didn't get the good measurement. That must be it here, is that we did another adjustment. And now finally, yeah, there we go. I think we're like 2.6, which splits the difference, and the motor is also 2.4 or 2.5. So we've got between the two about 6 degrees. So we can see the front of the suspension, so the wheel mounts to this kingpin, and it goes, the center of it's a little bit forward of where it would be on the Capri, but because the Mustang suspension has more caster in it, that works out. These are our tires. We got 2 sets of wheels and 2 sets of tires, a set of Yokohamas, a set of Hanuks, and then we got tires mounted to that rear axle, and the Mustang axle is wider than the Capri by quite a bit. You know, you get half the tire hanging out beyond the body of the car. So I was a little worried about that, and then I saw that Ken Block has, you know, he does big fenders on the back of his car. We'll be okay. We'll come up with something. So now we need to do some welding, and we have this Lincoln 170 TIG welder. I TIG welded kind of in school 30 years ago now, and enjoyed it. Never did enough of it to get muscle memory. So Keaton and I are both kind of coming up to speed on TIG welding. Right here, you see the lights go out because I need to change out fuses, and we're wiring up the 220 for this TIG welder. And really, it's what we've been doing for the last week, is practice welding, getting our TIG welding skills up to speed. We've got a bunch of parts out of the Capri to sell on eBay. We're kind of excited about that. Will help fund things going forward. I'm sorry this one isn't as exciting as some of the others, but I hope you'll stay tuned. I hope you give it a like if you liked it, and there will be more soon of assembly.